It's a real delight to be here, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for the very kind invitation to come and speak to you today. I realise it's my first time to speak to you as an organisation because I never get asked back to the same place twice. So I owe a great debt of gratitude, and I heard about Puffcall U3A with held in such esteem, so it's a pleasure to be here. Now, I've had a really interest for many years into why it is that Wales has had this kind of universal image of being the land of song. Although it took me a good 30 years to finally put together all of the kind of evidence and stories I'd gathered, and it wasn't until lockdown that I finally write this particular book called A Royal Choir for Wales. Ironically, using lockdown period to write a book about a land of music at a time when we were all silenced in our own homes, and those choirs were no longer combining in their rehearsal rooms and their concert halls. But I've always wondered, why is it that Wales, a limited population as we are, with a small landmass compared to many other countries on this planet of ours, how is it that we produce so much great talent? How have we managed to fight well above our weight then in producing such a plethora of musicians, particularly when it comes to singers? Now, let's be honest. Can every Welsh man and woman sing? No. Those who can probably think it's down to the cold spring-like water they drink, or maybe the warm frothy beer, or maybe too much of the latter makes them think they're better singers than they actually are. But there is something about the Welsh when it comes to being recognised for its musicality. And even today, I guess, if you look at the different genres of music that are in this world, we're in there somewhere. If you think of the world of opera, when they didn't get much bigger, really, than the likes of Sir Geraint Evans and Stuart Burrows and Margaret Price and Gwyneth Jones, and now, of course, Sir Bryn Terfel. If you think of popular music and easy listening, well, Shirley Bassey and good old Tom don't get much bigger than that. And even those who love the sound of a global rock band in the Stereophonics or the Manic Street Preachers can see their outreach and their great export for the Welsh culture. So undoubtedly we have produced some great performers, but in all honesty, Land of Song owes itself really more to a period when it was the working class people themselves who raised their voices in song and created really a culture of their own, in many respects also creating a form of nationhood and patriotism about Wales that we were sadly lacking in the mid-Victorian era. Now, I've always had an interest in choirs simply because I spent 30 years of my life as a member of a male voice choir in Wales. I'm not going to tell you which one it is, because there's always people in an audience with an affiliation with a choir of some sort, and we all start arguing who's got the best choir, and then it fights out onto the streets, and before you know it, we've all fallen out. So I'm not going to give you the pleasure, sorry. But it starts with T and ends with Ryorki. That's all I'm going to say. So my 30 years then gave me a real insight into why is it that these people come together twice a week and rehearse? Why do they go on these extensive tours? Why do they perform together on these stages? What is this camaraderie that brings them together? And I found it a fascinating subject. And how do we get to this stage? And I'm going to use Treorchy as an example of a male voice choir later on in the talk. So really and truly, if I can use them as an example of a typical Welsh male choir, then similarly, I like to look at the Rhondda as a typical example of a South Wales industrial community. You know, really and truly, that kind of inauspicious beginnings, really, of a partnership between heavy industry and non-conformism were really the two elements that brought this culture of choral singing to the fore in Wales. There's no doubt about it. And although we experienced industrialisation in the northern parts of our land, it's really here in the south that this culture becomes incredibly rich and creates really a form of tribal warfare, really, amongst the working class people. It certainly galvanises communities to come together. Now, the Rhondda, as an example, really, of one of these coal mining areas, of course, was two rather lush green agricultural valleys, scattered farmhouses. 950 people lived there up until 1850. They had 3 chapels, 1 parish church, an Anglican church, but singing wasn't necessarily part of Sunday worship. You associate music really with the Catholic faith, although Anglicanism does embrace kind of hymnals and the coming of the Common Prayer Book. It's really down to those religious revivals that brings hymn singing into the fore in non-conformist religions. And it'll take a long time for that really to gather pace. It isn't until the mid-1800s in Wales do you start seeing the emergence of chorus masters in chapels. Or, for instance, maybe an upright piano, let alone a pipe organ. And I'm sure any singing that was done in those chapels at that time would have been in unison anyway. But the Rhondda valleys, as those two valleys, of course, would change forever with the coming of the sinking of the first deep colliery in 1851. And that was part of the Bute Company when they sank their shaft at Cwm Saerbren in the north of the valley. Suddenly, of course, these valleys will change into a vast black Klondike, really, penetrated indiscriminately by those early coal pioneers in the search of this rich steam coal, in the search of this black gold. People came together from different backgrounds, different parts of the country, whether it was Southern Ireland, Cornwall, southwest of England, mid Wales, West Wales. Any of you, I'm sure here, may have had ancestors who came as part of that mass migration too. Some of them coming very much with their own cultures, their own religious convictions, musical traditions, sporting traditions, and all sort of thrust together in these huge melting pots, really, of these new industrial, rather narrow, dark valley communities. They must have been volatile, exciting, and people often say close-knit. That strong sense of community that was incredibly important to people who lived there. And there's no doubt in my mind why people were so close and why communities were so close-knit. It's because on a daily basis, the people faced the same adversaries as each other. They faced the same hardships. They faced the same kind of common enemy, really, and that was the ability to survive, often through the harshest, really, of lives. If you can imagine, in the first 50 years of the coal industry in the Rhondda, 900 men lost their lives underground in the first 50 years. We're not talking about those big pit explosions you see as headline news of men and boys dying in their dozens and dozens. We're talking almost a daily fatality of a collapse of a pit prop or a small gas explosion. We're also, of course, never told about the long-term health problems people will face, of dust on the lung, of pneumoconiosis, of the fact that men, average age of a death of a man in the Rhondda in 1865 was 49. Or the high infant mortality rate. 1 in every 5 child in the Rhondda by 1870 was dead before its first birthday. And you forget about the role that women played. Some of them did work underground, but by and large their role was the backbone of those communities. And when the price of coal was good on the open market, then that was reflected in a pretty good wage packet for the collier. But once that sliding scale comes into being, and the price of coal on the open market drops, then so does the wage. And you see women, of course, depriving themselves possibly of food when income is low, or at times of strike when there's no income at all, to ensure their family are fed before them. And that's why you see peaks, really, in premature death of women at the time, of things like malnutrition and exhaustion. That's the only miserable part of the talk, I promise you. But the reason I give it is to give you really an insight into the fact that it wasn't all how green is my valley. It wasn't the Hollywood look of what mining was about, that there was a real price to pay. And although people harken back with something of too much of rose-tinted glasses for my liking, of really and truly the hardships that people suffered. But there was, of course, one eternal flame, really, one great light for these people, was the relationships and the friendships they forged between one another. And they came together and they created this kind of community cohesion by uniting in the one place they went to on a regular basis, not just on a Sunday, but throughout the week as well. And that was one of these. Now, the Rhondda, when it would be fully built, would have 36 villages and towns. And those 36 villages would have 73 working deep collieries. And yet, it would also have 152 of these. These were more, though, than just places of public worship. These were places that people enjoyed entertainment. Maybe they had their first experience of things like the Gaman the music festivals. They got to hear at Easter and Christmas those great oratorios like the Elijah and the Messiah. Or maybe they'd get to hear an operetta. They'd get to see an orchestra. They'd also get to enjoy penny readings and Band of Hope and all these things that are going on throughout the week. Also, it's a place of education too. The Sunday school system is very strong, and you can go so far as to argue that nonconformity played a big part in Victorian Wales in saving the Welsh language. Also a place where political debates are often held. Before the building of the big miners' institutes, it was here that maybe the congregation would hear from one of these new up-and-coming left-wing socialists telling all about the great and the good of the labour movement. So these were places that were used on a daily basis. And of course, a place of religious worship, very much so on a Sunday. And as people gathered and they came to be part of chapel life, so too you see the emergence of congregational singing. You know, I think it'll baffle historians forever why Wales had this land of song image stuck on it. It owes an awful lot to this particular tradition and to the fact that people came together and began to sing in chapel, and it became such a big part of Sunday worship. But why on earth did we sort of embrace it in such a way? It's remarkable, really. At the end of the day, of course, it also saw the creation of things like choral societies, of mixed choirs like this one. You would see the fact of the matter that people went there because they were singing as part of worship, and those hymns they were singing were often incredibly emotional. They were being swept away on the sheer euphoria of singing some of this music with its fervent amen sections, and the fact that they were being whipped up in a storm, really, of emotion in that actual service, and feeling closer to God by singing these pieces. We in Wales were also writing some pretty good hymns like that too, and it's no wonder that people embraced them the way they did. But it was more than just God, I think. I think people as well realised, like we do today, any of you who are members of choirs, congregational, community choirs, whatever, I bet you feel better after a good rehearsal or a good concert. You feel somewhat relaxed by the experience, the fact you can get something off your chest by having a good old sing. Well, physically, of course, it's more than well documented that singing is good for the diaphragm and the lungs, and the heart is pumping. That's obvious to all. But it's only been in the last 30 years that we see more evidence to show how important singing is, choral singing at least, to your own mental health and to reducing anxiety and stress, and why so many organisations like 10 of Us, Parkinson's societies, dementia awareness, are creating choirs, because it's there to help people who are either being treated or are supporting those who are going through it too. Singing really allows you that moment of escapism from it all, and certainly I think had a great effect on people who were living in the valleys of industrial south of this particular time. And although we take it now as a scientific fact, I reckon our great-grandparents knew that for a fact 150 years ago, that singing made them feel good. And undoubtedly in chapel is where they're experiencing the best of it. But of course, it's almost like a Big Bang moment too in Wales, in that a few things happen that also kind of enhance this musicality, really. There's the fact that the passenger railway transport is becoming more widespread in the 1860s in Wales. And also that in 1861, the National Eisteddfod is resurrected in Aberdeen. And although there isn't a single musical category in the first Eisteddfod, that'll soon change. But if people are singing, and they're singing in choirs at home, then now they can start to travel and sing elsewhere. But how on earth are we learning to sing when really and truly the greater part of a population of working class people can hardly spell their own name? With the intricacies of staff notation, of the treble and bass clef of those crotchets, quavers and minims, it was baffling for many, many people. But luckily for us, there was a far simpler form of musical notation that we could teach people en masse, really, how to sing and sight read. You may remember the modulators hanging in your classroom as children, but it was an Italian monk who thought of the idea, patented very well by an Englishman called John Kerwin, who felt that those 8 letters of do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do were the easiest way of teaching music to the masses. Regardless of changes in key, as long as you knew your notes, could sight read them, and understood those dots and dashes were all about timings and beats in the bar. I'm not going to give you a lesson in tonic so far today. I can assure there's plenty of exams and Universities began running courses on them. I always say the best tonic so far lesson you'll ever get will probably come on Christmas Day at about 3:30 on BBC Two. There'll be a nun up a mountaintop in Austria singing all about it to 7 children. You know, just listen to Julie Andrews, girls and boys. That's Do-Re-Mi for you. It was something that city people embraced, and learning music so quickly, I think, was turning people's heads too. And it was at a particular time when an Italian journalist came over to Wales and wrote this magnificent kind of travel piece about his experiences of Cardiff and going further north. And he said, Wales is just like Italy, in the rain. He had it. And they were talking about our singing, our love of singing, and the quality of our composers and our singers too. You know, by the 1880s, 1890s, opera companies were coming to Wales and holding open auditions, because even they'd heard in London, in your Sadler's Wells and your Glyndebourne, that we had good singers down here. And rather than pay for them to go up there, they were holding auditions here and taking people almost off the street in many respects. But there's something about this particular period must have been very exciting, and to see all of this music becoming such a big part of people's lives. And it took a Welshman called Ieuan Gwyllt, who had a printing company. That wasn't his real name, that was his bardic name. He was a hymn writer and an arranger of music. And he also was a publisher. He had a printing company in Merthyr Tydfil and one in Wrexham. And he decided in 1865 to publish a volume of work called Y Cerddor Cymraeg, the Welsh musician. It was basically almost like a magazine full of staff and tonic so far music. You know, if we're to believe that every Victorian family in Wales enjoyed a Sunday afternoon in the parlour around the upright piano singing ballads, folk tunes, hymns and arias, then it was probably from this book they got their music. Ieuan Gwylt's first attempt at publishing Y Cerddor Cymraeg came with something of a reaction from the investors in the company. They laughed at him, basically. But he was recognising there was something happening in Wales, that people were starting to become far more musically talented than we put it down to. And he suggested Y Cerddor Cymraeg would sell well. Well, they laughed. In week 1, he sold 20,000 copies. In week 2, he sold 65,000 copies. In week 3, they stopped laughing. And he recognised the fact that he knew what he was talking about. And he could see that people were being galvanised by this love of singing, and that we were being recognised as something rather important. At a time in our history, really, when Wales was considered, dare I say, quite an inferior race of people compared to our neighbours, that all that was really of use was the mineral resources under our feet and the workforce we were providing. Our language, our history, our literature, our culture wasn't being recognised as being unique. And up until 1932, don't forget, Encyclopaedia Britannica would say, for Wales, see England. It did nothing to boost the confidence of the Welsh people, or really give us a very good audience to the rest of the world either. But singing was becoming the one thing that we were starting to be really good at, and different to the norm. But it took an unlikely national hero to make it headline news. Griffith Rhys-Jones, a blacksmith, from the village of Trecunnan near Aberdare. His statue stands proudly in Victoria Square in Aberdare to this day. Griffith Rhys-Jones was known by his bardic name of Caradog. Even as a child, he learned to play the violin and was known as the Paganini of Wales. He was so well trained as a violinist. But he was also a conductor, an arranger, and a composer, who, I have to say, having experienced many a musical director in my life, has many of the qualities that a conductor tends to have. Okay, musically gifted, also usually quite bad-tempered, lack of patience generally, enjoys picking on one particular section of the choir than the rest, and often slightly drunk, quite frankly. And Caradog had all of these features, it must be said. He was quite, in this photograph, he almost gives an impression of being a bit of hard work. But in 1872, he learns that Crystal Palace Company in London are going to hold a music festival, which will include a competition for choral organisations with a 1,000 guinea prize. For him, it's the ideal opportunity to put together a choir from Wales. He picks 9 choirs from different chapels in different parts of South Wales, from Neath to Bridgend, Maesteg, Rhondda, Aberdare, Pontypridd, over to Merthyr Pontypool and Eberville, and one in Cardiff too. They're all rehearsed independently by different conductors, and he brings them together for one rehearsal in Cardiff. Now, the Crystal Palace choral competition, which was sponsored by Gilbert and Sullivan, allowed each of the choirs that entered 9 pieces of large classical choral music. We're talking kind of heavyweight stuff, really. Mendelssohn, Wagner, Beethoven, Handel, real heavy classical works. They'd get to rehearse 9 pieces, and on the day of the competition, would have to perform any 3 that the adjudicators requested. So it was quite a tough competition, really. Well, Caradog took his choir to London. They got to Crystal Palace, and they took 40 minutes to get on stage because they kept arguing who should be in the front row. When they finally got there, they looked down for the upright piano. No piano. A 32-piece string orchestra was going to perform alongside them. Well, these people had never even seen an orchestra. They went dramatically out of tune, a bar and a half too fast. Caradog threw his baton at the altos and said, "For God's sake, just listen to the band," which in a chaos upset all of the instrumentalists in the orchestra, who were being rather snobby, don't want to be considered bandsmen. They're orchestral players. So it's almost like a carry-on chaos prevails. He has to apologise to the adjudicators, the instrumentalists and the choir, and he's allowed to start the second time. Rough and ready at the start, but they come into their own, and by the end of the 3rd piece, he feels rather pleased with the performance, and they win. They not only win the 1,000 guineas, they also win the national trophy, which in itself is rather a beautiful piece of workmanship. What's important about Caradog's choir is that well before we had a Football Association of Wales, or before we had a Welsh Rugby Union, his choir was the first group, really, of Welsh people that performed or competed on behalf of Wales in an international competition. So before we learned the rugby game, it really was his choir that went out and performed on behalf of Wales under the national flag, really, as a competitive team. He knew that he didn't want to be just a one-hit wonder either. By the following year, he had much more support from choirs in the north and the west. He also had the support of the Welsh gold miners in California, who had a solid gold baton made for him. James Howells, in his department store, of course, no longer there, sadly, in Cardiff, had beautifully embroidered Welsh flags made. Even Richard Crauchete, the Iron King, at Cyfarthfa in Merthyr, allowed them to rehearse with the Crauchete Orchestra to ensure they didn't go to tune a second time. And when they went to Crystal Palace the second year, they were said to be even better than the first. And they won a second time. On the way home from London on that occasion, in the intervening year, Caradog had left Aberdeen. He'd gone to move to Treorchy to become the landlord of the Treorchy Hotel, because he was also the founding director of the new Rhondda Brewery Company. May I say profits were in short supply with him as director. That's all I'm saying. But when they reached Cardiff, he left the train and boarded the one for the Rhondda with some of the choristers, and the journey was rather quiet. And he didn't notice on the journey that there was bunting in streets. There were posters in windows on the platform of certain train stations. Things like this were appearing. Caradog, he led them to victory. Well, he sounds a bit more like a gladiator home from the arena, doesn't he? Or Mr. Churchill in the war effort, I don't know. An unlikely national hero he was. But when he got to one of the railway stations called Ystrad, in the Rhondda Fawr, in the larger of the two valleys, he wrote in his diary, all I could see was a sea of upturned faces. About 5,000 people were waiting for him on the platform and in the adjoining streets. They sat him in a bardic chair and carried him shoulder high through the valley to Treorchy town itself, several miles away. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. Thousands were in the middle of Stag Square, in the middle of the town. People were hanging out of windows upstairs above the shops. He stood on top of the chair and he conducted them in a rather a loud and fast rendition of March of the Men of Harlech and Deryn Aur. And while all this victory was going on, he got up on top of the chair second time and gave this rousing speech in which he said, Gwlad y Gan yw Gymru I gyd, all Wales is a land of song. A wonderful turn of phrase, not used before in any evidence I get to find, I love to think that he created and made it popular. Because what his choir was doing, and had done, was that people were starting to recognise that the Welsh did indeed have a great culture of their own, that they also had a quality to their performance, and that they also appreciated good music, classical music too. It was a slow start, but it was a start nonetheless. And although the land of song will owe an awful lot to those mixed choirs and choral societies and women's choirs and children's choirs, I suppose we have to all agree that in many respects, Land of Song also is a large gratitude to the male voice choir. Now, the male voice choir, however, started off its life in a very different musical arena than mixed choirs. Whereas they were part of chapel life, the male voice choirs were part of a different chapel altogether. And that was usually in the pub. Now, I'm not going to suggest that every miner, after 12 hours in the bowels of the earth, is going to be shot to the top of the cage and walk home several miles, singing Carol Lan all the way. They were probably too exhausted for that. But there's plenty of evidence showing how miners worked together on the coalface and sang together too, singing becoming naturally part of their daily shift. Of course, there's a huge sense of camaraderie between them, this butty mentality of men working together and also saving each other's lives. There was a great strength of friendship there, great bonds. And musically, I'm sure they all enjoyed singing too. If not underground, then back in the pub on the way home. After all, they had told their wives in no uncertain terms that it was scientifically proven that 3 pints of good Welsh ale would dust down the blackness on the lungs and would give them a healthier lifestyle. Who were the wives to complain? And of course, I'm sure they sang together with their partners in chapel on a Sunday. But you have to think of the fact too that these communities were very male-dominated, very masculine communities too, because the original inhabitants of them would have been young men. They were the ones who would have gone and sunk these pits. They were the ones who would have built the reading rooms and billiard halls, the miners' institutes, the shops, the schools, the public houses, and all of these cinemas and dance halls, and plenty of monotonous streets of terraced houses too. And young men in particular, are pretty competitive at the best of times. At this time, however, team sport wasn't really in abundance. As far as ball games were concerned, well, in Glamorganshire we had Knappen and Bando, which were 2 very unruly, greasy ball games. There was no rugby. Football was a very upper middle class public school sport at the best of times. And really and truly, men had things like bare knuckle boxing, foot racing, horse racing, cards, dominoes, really, to indulge themselves with that kind of competitiveness. That was until the coming of the Eisteddfod. The Eisteddfod in its early days in the 1800s was a different setup to what it is today, in that they were often held in schoolrooms, in public houses, in chapels, and of course in marquees on open fields. But the prizes they offered were really things like cups, shields and trophies. They were often cash prizes. And what we see in Wales is the formation of a whole new tradition of men who work together in the pit or sing together in chapel, get to learn of an Eisteddfod coming to the locality. They get together, they rehearse the test pieces, they go along and compete, and if they win the prize money, straight to the pub they go. At the end of the day, if they didn't, or even if they did, once the competition is over, they probably disbanded just as quickly. And maybe got together again 6 months down the line to try for another cash prize. It's a very spluttered existence at the start of these choirs. And that's why really some of the larger male voice choirs in Wales today that originate in Victorian times are difficult really to give them an actual point of when they were formed, simply because of this kind of haphazard sort of tradition behind it. But cash prizes also creates a real rivalry between these men. I have to say that although we think of the football hooliganism of the 1980s in Britain, the choral hooliganism of the 1880s in Wales was pretty questionable too. There's lots of stories of fisticuffs in the Eisteddfod. Many a chorister went home with a bloodied nose. The police were often called to many a marquee just to keep peace and quiet while the Eisteddfod's going on. It seems ridiculous and petty to us today, But that rivalry was intense. This was like tribal warfare. Like your own local football side, they had supporters too that would go along with them. There was betting going on behind the scenes. There was a bit of gambling. Who was your winning choir? Some adjudicators demanded to have police escorts to the train station because they were feared for their own lives if they give the prize to a choir that came from another town other than the one in which the festival was being held. You get one lovely story of a choir on stage in Caerphilly singing away in a marquee, and their rivals go on the back, pull up all the pegs, and watch the whole building collapse on top of them halfway through. One of my favourites, and slightly more covert, I always think, is the choir on stage in a little town in Porth in the Rhondda, and their rivals walk in and sit in the first two front rows of the audience, trying to give them that look, you know, to put them off. And when they don't, on a certain point of performance in the music, they all light their clay pipes and start blowing smoke at them as well, just to try and make them cough halfway through. Yes, it was petty. Was it serious? I think it really was in some regard. In 1891, Wales played England in rugby for the 10th time in Newport. The International was held in Newport that year. Plenty of railway transport, no reason why you couldn't have a good show of spectators, and 8,500 people turn up to watch us take on our rivals. The same year, at the National Eisteddfod, the male voice choir competition, which they always called the Battle of the Giants, drew an audience of 24,000 people. That's how popular competitive male voice choir singing was to rugby. You can imagine really how strong this rivalry was, and how it was that this background really created the emergence of male voice choir singing in Wales. And that's how the Treorchian District Society, they came about in 1883. The reason they were formed is because it was a group of about 20 colliers in the Park Colliery near Treorchy who were going to say a fond farewell to one of their friends who was emigrating to New Zealand, so the chances are they wouldn't see him ever again. And they decided to give him a farewell evening do in the Red Cow pub in the centre of Treorchy. Everything goes well, and then 8 o'clock comes and disaster has struck the group. They've decided that the kitty is too small and they've got no money left. So fearing the thought of going home early, the landlord says, well, there's one opportunity here for you, is that upstairs in the concert room above the bar, which is quite a large concert room in fact, there's an Eisteddfod being held. If you can get up there and try a piece of music and see if you win, then the beer will be on the bar. So the group of them got together in the bar, and one of them was an organist in his local chapel. He was called George Thomas Bach. No affiliation with German composers, because he was my height, really, to be honest with you. And he put them through a quick rehearsal in the bar. They were all in the age of 25. There was only about 24 of them, I suppose. And upstairs they went and they sang, and they won £1 for their efforts. Back down to the bar they went to. And the test piece for the way, well, you probably never heard of it. It was a popular love song in Wales. I've never sung it either, and you probably never heard it. Mavana or something it was called. Well, the popularity of this choir is such that they start to rehearse frequently. Rather than disband, they stick together. In 1885, they go to an Eisteddfod in Whitsun in St. Fagans, and the test piece is this large kind of Victorian war horse of a piece by Adolf Adams called Comrades in Arms. Well, they sing it well and they win £25, a fair bit of money for this group of men. But what they need is a more professional conductor, and luckily for them, someone like that has walked into town. His name is William Thomas. Comes from Mountain Ash. He's the director of the local cooperative society in Treorchy. He's also the chorus master of Noddfa Baptist Chapel, and he's hated by every single child in the parish because he's the school attendance officer, the whipper in. Well, they approached William Thomas. Will you become our conductor? Yes, he said. And then he drops the bombshell on them. He's teetotal. No rehearsals in the pub. 20% of them resign on the spot. How can we possibly have dry rehearsals? Beer is obviously good for the larynx, but he's not having any of it. And within a few short years, with him as conductor, they win their first national Eisteddfod in 1888 in Brecon. Now, the words we use in Wales, Cythrail y Canu, means the devil or the demon in music, we're talking rivalry. And I think you've got a better idea what this rivalry is about at the time. Today, I think rivalry amongst male voice choirs is awful, but you can see how powerful it was. And unfortunately for Treorchy, they had their rivals, but they were based only 1.5 miles away in the village of Tonpentre. And their rivals were called the Rhondda Glee Society. They'd been a male voice choir since 1877, and they came head-to-head 11 times. Treorchy won 6 prizes, they won 3 prizes, and on 2 occasions, the adjudicators just separated the money between them and said, let's all go home in harmony today. What a bunch of cowards, I thought. Their conductor was a man called Tom Stevens. Now, Tom Stevens and William Thomas were both from the Cynon Valley. They both conducted children's choirs. They both sang in Caradog's choir in Crystal Palace. They both come to the Rhondda as chorus masters, and now they both had male voice choirs of note. That's where the similarity ended, though. William Thomas remained teetotal, whereas Tom Stevens was the landlord of the Blacksmith's Arms in Treherbert, and they never really did see eye to eye after that. Their big moment came at the National Eisteddfod in Pontypridd in 1893, where the Rhondda Glee Society beat them by a point. And they got to have this golden ticket, really, to go and perform at the Chicago World Fair. They were gone for several months. They beat 23 other choirs out there. But the Rhondda Glee Society found themselves almost bankrupt, and every week had to keep sending another chorister home, so they couldn't afford to feed him. And when they finally came back themselves, they had no money at all. It took them a while to recover, but they had a good trip with it, nothing else. But the Treorchy men were determined to win back this National Eisteddfod title. And it came in 1895 at Llanelli. The competition was rather late at the night, so when they were announced winners, rather than try and get home, they decided to stay in digs and the following day celebrate by going to the sands at Mumbles Beach. They sat there for several hours, it was said. I love to think of them there, with their trousers rolled up to their knees and their Sunday best, and I'm sure many a knotted handkerchief was found. And they start singing on the sands. And suddenly, an open-topped, horse-drawn carriage appears, and out steps this rather elegantly dressed lady who approaches the conductor and introduces herself. She's the Countess of Dunraven. She asks whether the choir would be willing to sing at her castle, Dunraven Castle then, of course, which at that time overlooked the cliffs at Southerndown. They go along the following weekend and perform in her banqueting hall. Over that summer, they go there twice. The second time to sing for the American ambassador to Great Britain. Because although Dunraven herself was quite a socialite and quite a mover and shaker, of course her husband was a real prominent member of the House of Commons and pulled many a string there too. And between them, I think, somehow or other, they managed to get rather a significant concert lined up for Treorchy. They both felt that this choir deserved a better audience than it was getting in Wales. But I'm sure not even William Thomas could have imagined when the telegram arrived to say the Queen has decided to hear Welsh choir. Now, what was important about this telegram was Queen Victoria and Prince Albert had seen a Welsh choir once before at Penrhyn Quarry, but they'd never called a Welsh choir by royal command. They'd never had a concert with a Welsh choir before. So all of a sudden, what this telegram was telling people, at least as far as the Welsh newspapers were concerned, that this invitation was more than just about a group of amateur singers from a coal mining industry, from the Rhondda. It was about the fact that the Queen was now recognising that Wales did indeed have a culture of their own, and that this was almost like a great royal seal of approval, you know. It also meant that the Treorchy men celebrated this news with sheer joy. The same cannot be said for the Rhondda Glee Society, who were blinking furious. Tom Stevens tried to get the postmaster sacked. He claimed he'd given the telegram to the wrong choir, and it should have been them. Well, William Thomas was having none of it. And on November the 29th, 1895, they travel by Great Western Railway for free to Windsor. They stop at Cardiff on the way and pick up Dr. Joseph Parry, the composer, because his hymn tune Aberystwyth is in the programme. They reach Windsor, get into their overnight accommodation, and then meet under the streetlight at 10:15 on the entrance to the castle, and walk 2 abreast into St. George's Hall. 60 people are there in the audience, The greater majority of them are members of the royal family, also staff at the castle, and specially invited guests. And at 10:05, Queen Victoria emerges on the arm of her Indian attendant, Abdul. She calls on William Thomas twice. The first time she says what wonderful voices they have. Are they all miners? To which he said, yes, ma'am, they are. And the second time she asks, do you sing the national anthem in Welsh? To which he said, no, ma'am, God Save the Queen is always sung in English, which apparently she laughed. And at the end of the concert, requested 2 encores. When she left the room, members of the family mingled with the choristers and said in all the years they had attended royal concerts, they'd never heard of her asking for 2 encores. Certainly one occasionally, but never 2. She must have made a great impression on her. And the headlines in the Western Mail the next day quite simply said, they behaved like gentlemen and sang like angels. The following day, of course, full of the joys of what they'd announced and what they'd done, they went to London for the day, got into the House of Lords, stood in the foyer and sang Men of Harlech. And the police arrived and tried to arrest them all for being a public nuisance and move them along. Wondering who these people were. Wouldn't believe they'd sang for Queen Victoria the night before. But when they got back to Wales, William Thomas was then informed that the Queen really had enjoyed the concert and she wanted to make a gift to him of a baton to always remember the event. It was a beautiful ebony baton with a VR insignia inscribed on it and encrusted with sapphires, rubies and diamonds. And quite a gift it was too. I should say that on the Glee Society, they did get to Windsor eventually. Well, they petitioned Gladstone so much that he organised the concert, I think. He got them up there. Queen Victoria didn't ask for an encore. And all she gave the conductor was a time pin. So even then, they felt a little bit inferior. But William Thomas, of course, now had a celebrity choir to his name. The trouble was, with a choir of this size, of 80 men, he was being offered tours of England, Scotland, Ireland. There was talk of the Americas. There was talk of the conservatoires in Paris. He couldn't take 80 men for a week season in Cardiff. He couldn't afford to pay the wages they were having in the pit. They couldn't leave their jobs and leave their families. It was a difficult one. Ticket money in theatres wouldn't be enough to cover the costs. And so he had to make, I think, rather a difficult decision. He streamlined his choir down. He basically picked his 25 best voices, all of the soloists included, and 4 of his sons, I must admit, and created a new slimline choir called the Royal Welsh Choir of Treorchy. And to be fair, for the next 100 years, as a semi-professional choir, they were very successful. They sang for every British monarch, for every Prime Minister too. They sang at the launch of the Queen Mary. In 1965, they also appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show, and afterwards went to the night spots of New York with Jimmy Durante. They had quite a life. One of their first major tours was the Colonial Tour of 1908. I just love the title of this tour, of the period, it just says it all. They were gone for 2 years. They gave 560 concerts. They went to South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and America. They finished off in the White House for Teddy Roosevelt. But halfway across America, they stopped just outside Omaha in Nebraska. And the governor of the state is there to greet them and says, would you try and find some time in your program to perform a short afternoon concert for a tribe of Native Americans on their reservation? And he said yes. William Thomas said yes, of course we will. They went along to this reservation, and apparently the concert went well. There was an exchange of gifts, and they left the reservation having made newfound friends with the Native Americans. All except one chorister, however. He suddenly turned to his fellow mates and said, I'm not continuing on the tour. I'm going to stay on the reservation. And much to their surprise, they asked why. He said, well, because I've fallen madly in love with the daughter of the chief of the tribe. I'm going to win her hand in marriage. I'm going to become a Native American myself, and I'm staying here. And they left him behind, much to their shock. Not half as shocked as his wife and 5 children back home. I know his grandson actually, and he said he did come home 25 years later. He said it was a cold day in Treorchy, that street. But as the 20s and 30s will emerge in the last century, you see, of course, periods of severe economic decline, particularly in the South Wales coalfield. But it also sees the start of a new kind of golden era of male voice choirs. It's a strange phenomenon, but a lot to do with the fact that men are out of work, trying to find something to do with their day, or at least by forming a choir, maybe holding benefit concerts and raising money for the strike. That's why really you see the emergence, I would say, of 3 Welsh choirs in particular from the 20s onwards. I'm not going to say they're better than anybody else, but the 3 of them dominate the National Eisteddfod arena as winners. And the first of them from the 20s and 30s really make a name for themselves. They're also from the Rhondda, strange enough. They're from Ferndale. A group of choristers get together in 1924, form a choir, call it after the local railway signal box, and Penderys Male Choir is created. 11 years later, in the Morris United Chapel in the Swansea Valley, a group of choristers fall out with the conductor because he's annoyed that they come to rehearsals on a Sunday smelling of beer. So they leave and they form their own choir. And 1935 will see the Morriston Orpheus Choir being created. October 1946, the mobbed soldiers from the Second World War come back to the Rhondda to live, and they recreate the original Treorchy and District Male Voice Choir in October 1946. And they will win more consecutive National Eisteddfodau than the other 2 put together. What I think is remarkable about these choirs, though, is that the 3 of them, in their time, will have EMI record contracts. They'll become television stars, really. They'll get to work with some great entertainers, from Julie Andrews to Andrea Bocelli and Ozzy Osbourne to Ella Fitzgerald. They'll get to tour extensively, and they'll all get royal concerts in their time. But the 3 of them are founded by 3 rather unremarkable men, in the sense that they weren't great orators, they weren't necessarily great flamboyant maestros. They were very ordinary, quiet, humble men too. Arthur Duggan in Penderys, Ivor Sims in Morriston, John Hayden Davis in Treorchy. Great leaders, knew their music, grew up in chapel, tonics all far. Not a single musical qualification between them. One was a baker, one was an insurance broker, one was a primary school teacher. But what a legacy they kind of left, really and truly, was quite remarkable. And before I leave, I'll tell you very quickly that I guess I like to give this talk amongst 4 or 5 other talks I give, not hinting to come back, but just in case you're stuck in the future. The one thing I like to say about this talk is that I always hope that people think, well, maybe I should join a choir, because I can honestly say that it really did allow me an opportunity to meet people I'd never have met, to travel to places in the world I'd never have gone, and to experience things I'd never have experienced. And all because I'm a member of an amateur choir, really. You know, I got to sing 3 times to packed houses at the Sydney Opera House, the first Welsh choir to ever sing there. I sing a solo on this stage twice, and in one particular concert, finish off the first half of the concert with a Welsh folk tune called Unwaith Eto yng Nghymru Annwyl. One More Time, My Beloved Wales. A real song of the Welsh exiles, you know. And I got to sing it on the stage, and it was a great ender to the first half, not because I was singing it, because the arrangement is good, and the choir came in with this great sort of chorus at the end. And when I walked off the stage, I looked at the technical crew on the right of stage, and they're holding a telephone out. And I said, who's on the end of the telephone? And they said, we rung your mother and father in Llantrisant to make sure they heard you. And I felt a lump in my throat, and I said, I'm glad you told me after I'd sung it rather than before, that's for sure. Not long after, we start touring America and Canada. Month-long tours sometimes. In one concert in Carmel, in California, I'm called to the foyer because there's an elderly lady there who's asked to meet me, and she takes me out to dinner. I had no idea who this woman was. She turns out to be the Oscar-winning actress Joan Fontaine, the only one to win an Oscar for a Hitchcock film, and for the next 20 years, we're friends. She even asked me to marry her once, but I said, well, there is 70 years between us, Joan. You know. But she was lovely, kind to my parents and my partner. We went out and visited her many times. I'd never have got that if it wasn't for the fact I was in this choir. I'd never have got to the Royal Variety Show to be part of the lineup to meet the Queen. Similarly, in the last few years, I'd never have got to spend every St. David's Day for 3 consecutive years at the Hotel de Paris in Monte Carlo, where Prince Albert, who's a big Welsh rugby fan, by the way, also is president of the Monaco Welsh Society, and has these big Welsh dinners with Shirley Bassey at the head table. Never have had it. It was a great training ground, a great opener of life, I think, great one of experiences too. And this is one of my last events. I've got to tell you this very quickly before you throw me out, is that this was an advert we did. When Ryder Cup came to Celtic Manor, they decided, Sky Television, in their wisdom, decided they should put together a series of adverts that allowed Wales to have an audience to this new American audience, American people who are coming here. So what do? They stick a choir on a mountaintop by a castle singing hymns. If we'd had a couple of sheep, Max Boyce and Gareth Edwards, we'd have seen them a fortune, you know? So this is 5 o'clock in the morning. This is Carrick Kennan Castle on the way to Candailo there. We pre-recorded the track. We just had to go to the top of this mountain and sing. Now on the left of this picture, you can see the outline of something of a cliff edge. Well, we're talking a severe cliff edge here. If you haven't been there, you wouldn't go near the side, I can tell you that now. The drop is astonishing. We had to stand a little bit far back from the side of the cliff. And as we're singing, a helicopter will come up from the bottom of the valley floor with a film crew in it, filming the choir and the landscape and the castle. It looks lovely on film. Go and see it on YouTube. But as the helicopter came to this certain level, and the propellers going like crazy, 2 of the choristers really hadn't stuck their toupees down very well. So somewhere in Carrick Kennan Castle is a pair of wigs that have never been identified since this film was made. You know, Dylan Thomas said, "Thank the Lord, we are a musical nation." I like to think we still are. Ladies and gents, thanks very much for listening.